welcome everybody to this Battle of Ideas session, religious or spiritual or neither. My name is Helen Birtwistle, I'm the chair for this session. We all know the trend. Church attendance is falling rapidly, and with it an enthusiasm for formal religious practice. However, at the same time, there are a growing number of people who are now identifying themselves as spiritual. And there's also a significant rise in the number of people who are attached to charismatic churches and Pentecostalism as well. There are also, of course, a good number of people who would describe themselves as staunchly atheist, and that position has, of course, been well represented by Richard Dawkins, A.C. Grayling, and to some extent by the British Humanist Association over recent years as well. One of the questions that is asked in the blurb of this session is there a religion-shaped hole in our lives? Now, while that might sound like a facetious question, it does point to an important area for us to consider today. What area of our lives does spiritual actually refer to? Do we all have a spiritual life? And indeed, might spirituality, as some have suggested, be an innate attribute of us all? I know, of course, that our panel are going to disagree massively on this, and indeed many other questions as well. First, let me introduce at the end there Linda Woodhead, who's the Professor of Sociology of Religion at Lancaster University. She's also director of a £12 million UK research programme on religion and society, which involves 75 separate research projects and is going to be concluding its work in 2013. In her current work, she argues that we have entered a post-Reformation era in which religion becomes less doctrinal, centralised and priestly. We've been wanting to have Linda at the battle for quite some time, so it really is good to have her with us this weekend. So welcome to Linda. Second to speak is Andrew Copson, who's the Chief Executive of the British Humanist Association. He's led the BHA since 2010, having previously coordinated the organisation's education and public affairs work, and his writing on humanist and secularist issues has appeared in The Guardian, in The Independent, The Times, The New Statesman, as well as in various other journals as well. And Andrew's been a regular feature of the battle for, almost as long as the battle's been running, actually, so it really is, it's always fantastic to have him with us, and really important to have him on this session as well, so welcome to Andrew. Third speaker is Dr. Piers Benn, who's a co-producer of this session. He's lectured in philosophy at the universities of Leicester, St Andrews and Leeds, and in medical ethics at Imperial College and King's College. Piers writes for both academic and wider audiences and has made several appearances on the British media, including Nightwaves, The Moral Maze, NewsHour, Channel 4 News and Sky News. Fourth to speak is my old colleague, Dolan Cummings, who's an Associate Fellow as well of the Institute of Ideas, amongst many other things. Dolan was previously the Research and Editorial Director of the IOI from 2001 to 2010 and continues to edit our online review Culture Wars and writes about books, films and theatre, amongst various other things. He's also one of the co-founders of the Manifesto Club, a campaign group for freedom in everyday life. And last but by no means least, our final speaker is Elizabeth Oldfield, who's the director of the public theology think tank Theos, which undertakes research and provides comment on the role of faith in public life. She's previously worked for the Church and Media Network in the BBC, and she spoke last year at the Battle of Ideas, and we really just had to have her back again after that, so it's great to have her on the panel too. Okay, so that's all the introductions done. To kick us off then, Linda, over to you.
Thank you very much. Being a sociologist of religion, I'm going to say rather boringly, let's look at the evidence about this question of whether we're religious or spiritual or neither. And in fact, there's been a lot of research on the topic. I myself have done some of that research. In 2000, I was part of a poll that we devised for a BBC programme on the state of religion in Britain. And the numbers we found then were 31% of people called themselves a spiritual person, 31%. 27%, just slightly less, said a religious person. 8% said a convinced atheist, and the rest, and that's quite a sizable rest, were either agnostic, I'm not spiritual, I'm not religious, or I don't know. And that's a very sizable and often neglected group that I'm going to come back to. We also know something about how these identifications have been changing over time. And we know that the number calling themselves religious has been steadily declining over time, whilst the number calling themselves spiritual has been steadily growing. Another category which some surveys use that has been growing is the category of none, not having a religion. That's grown up to as much as 51% today, according to the British Social Attitudes Survey. But what do people mean when they say they're not religious, or they are, or they're spiritual, or what? What do they mean? One thing that people are talking about, if they say I'm religious or I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, is about authority. To say you're religious often sounds as if you, in our contemporary language, it sounds as if I'm someone who obeys external authority. Whereas to say I'm spiritual means actually I look to my own judgment about these matters. Another and perhaps more interesting shade of meaning behind religious or spiritual has to do with people's beliefs in, if you like, ultimate reality. You know, what's behind it all. And here we can see a kind of parallel shift in people's beliefs. So the numbers of people who believe in a spirit or life force have been growing steadily, whilst the number of people who believe in a personal God have been declining. Today, around 25% say they believe in a personal God, and 44% in a spirit or life force. But in that 2000 poll I mentioned, we asked a slightly more sophisticated version of this question, and we found this. 26% said they believed in a God, 21% a spirit or life force, 23% believed there is something there, 12% said I don't really know what to think, and 15% said, I don't really think there is any kind of God, spirit, or life force. So, to put it really simply, about half the population have a fairly clear idea and believe in God or spirit, and about half have a vaguer sense that there's something more, a lot of them, and a fewer number don't know or are clearly atheistic. And that helps us explain who those nuns are. I don't mean N-U-N-S, I mean the N-O-N-E-S. The nuns. Nuns, when people say 50% of people say they're none, they have no religion, it doesn't mean they're atheist. About up to 12% are atheist. Some of them don't know, but the majority think there's something there, but we don't really know what. So to conclude, religious, spiritual, or neither, the evidence shows that really you can think in terms of 5 quite significant groups in the UK today, and let's think of them as a spectrum. So at one end, you've got people who believe in God. Let's call them the Godders. Then you've got the Spiriters, who believe that a spirit or life force that flows through everything. Then you've got the something there-ers. Then the not surers. And then the there is nothing there. And the nothing there-ers. Now, at the moment, it's those two ends of the spectrum, the Godders and the nothing there-ers, who completely hog the debate and the media. But actually, in aggregate, most of us are spiriters, something there-ers, or not surers. So my conclusion is that we're actually, as a nation, rather cognitively modest, but everything about our media and our debates pushes those discussions towards, yes, there is a God, or no, there isn't a God.
Andrew.
Thanks very much. Well, I certainly want to agree with Linda and associate myself with her remarks to the extent that what she said was about the decline of formal religion. There's certainly no doubt that fewer and fewer people are religious, religious identity down to under 50%, religious practice down to the very, very low single figure percentages, and religious belief also down, though probably a bit higher than practice, and in decline. So in everything that Linda said about the way that religion is less and less of a feature of our society and of our beliefs these days, I completely agree. But I'm not really sure that the word spiritual covers what's left. You know, I'm not convinced that what people believe about the universe and about reality, what people believe about their values, how they should behave to other people, what people believe about the meaning of life or meaning in life or purpose in life can be covered with that word spiritual. I don't quite agree with the categories, I guess, that Linda has laid out. And before I come on to what I want to say, I want to refer just briefly to one thing that Linda said, which is that I have a problem with questions that ask people about whether they believe in a God or a higher force or a power behind it all or a life force, partly because it's difficult to really believe that people who say, yes, I believe in something behind it all, really mean the same thing by that, whether they really are, whether it's really possible at all to identify them as a single category of person. But also, it tells you almost nothing, in fact it tells you nothing at all, about how important that belief is to the person who's reporting it. If you put someone on the spot and say, you know, do you think there's something behind it all? Or do you think there's some sort of force or energy or whatever? They might sort of, you know, in a startled sense go, yes, you know, why not? There must be something behind it all. But that doesn't mean that that belief, if you can call it a belief, has any real impact on the way that they live their lives, on the way they think about other people, on the way they think about the universe. So I think that in many ways, most people have quite a materialistic way of thinking about both beliefs about the universe and reality, how things are and how we can know what they are, beliefs about morality, how we should relate to other people and what our obligations are to other people and to the planet, for example, and also beliefs about meaning, where fulfillment comes from in life, what gives life its colour and flavour and purpose. I think in all those three areas, people are a good deal more materialistic than the word spiritual might imply. And I want to give you a few statistics of my own to try and back that up. If we think for a moment about the question of how you decide what's true in the universe, how you decide whether, you know, something is there or isn't there. If you ask people if they believe in a life force or a spirit or whatever, or if they're spiritual, they may say yes. But if you ask them how they decide what is true and what is not true, you find, given the choice, that 62% of people will choose the statement that scientific evidence provides the best way to understand the universe, and that the other 38% of people, which is still a large number, don't get me wrong, but the other 38, only 38% of people, so a minority of people, will rely on other ways of knowing, religious ways of knowing, or transcendental ways of knowing, or whatever. If you ask people about their morality, how they decide how they should behave to other people, what the right thing to do, what the wrong thing to do, again, people primarily focus on human-centered, here and now-centered, pragmatic, prudential, the person in front of me and my relationship to them type motivations for doing good and avoiding harm, rather than by reference to any sort of transcendental external source for morality. Again, at about 63%, people will say that that's what morality consists of. And when you ask people about what gives their life meaning, what gives them a sense of purpose, what gets them up in the morning, very, very, very seldom will they refer to any sort of external reality, any sort of God or life force or divine impulse. Even people who say that they're religious or spiritual will put God or religious impulses about 10th on the list of 10 if you ask them what's important to them in their lives. Before all that comes family, our relationships with other people, our relationships with our friends, the adoption of goals in our lives, our relationship to the natural world, our sense of being in the universe. So all the ways, I think, in which we attribute meaning to experience as people living right now in Britain are better described not as spiritual, because they really heavily rely on the here and now and the material, and not as religious, but as neither.
Piers.
I'm concerned in my presentation with the question of whether it can make sense to say that you're spiritual but not religious. What is meant by spirituality? What is meant by religion? Huge topics in themselves, which I shan't try to address in detail, but it's common enough, as we've seen from the previous two speakers, for people to say things like, I'm spiritual but not religious. And it seems to me that very often what they really mean is, I'm spiritual, therefore not religious. And sometimes people even say, I'm not religious, therefore I'm spiritual. So there's some implied contrast between the religious and the spiritual. And that interests me. What exactly is driving this? And what is the emotional impetus, if you like, or even the ideological impetus behind that sort of attitude? Well, it seems to me religion, of course, is a complex subject, needs to say, and I'm not going to attempt a definition of religion. That would be absurd, whether in a 5-minute talk or a 5-year talk. But there seem to be 3 elements to religions as practiced. There is the believing element, with creeds, however vague they may be. There's the belonging, and there's the doing, the religious life, the life of worship, good works, praxis, if you like. And particularly the believing and the belonging side to this lead to the sense that religion should be something organized. So we have the idea of organized religion, and it's often this that the spiritual but not religious object to. Now, in practice, organized religion is often more like disorganized religion. Somebody close to me was recently ordained in the Church of England as a deacon, but one slight hiccup was that the church had lost her baptism certificate. So, there are all sorts of bureaucracies, all sorts of things go on. And indeed, the bureaucracy of the church is one very important part of the organization or disorganization of it. But organization also has implications of hierarchy, authority, prescribed practices, and, of course, prescribed beliefs. And the spiritual but not religious stance arises from skepticism and often outright hostility to the organized aspect to it. So let's take 2 aspects of the organization that people object to and see whether any coherent sense can be made of the objection. Do we end up with a woolly-minded, evasive mishmash that gets almost as bad as people believing in something, as you just heard from Linda and Andrew, or can we attach any better sense to it than that? Well, there are 2 aspects, I think, which come to mind in particular. One is the dogmatic aspect to organized religion, and the other is the authoritarian aspect to organized religion. Both these things are said to result in sterility, corruption, hypocrisy, the abuse of power, insider mentality. So sterility, we can all think of sort of farces about Father Eustace trying to make Father Gavin look silly by putting the altar cloth at the wrong length or something like that. The silly little rituals like this, fastidiousness. Then there's corruption. We don't need any, it's quite obvious what corrupt scandals have hit the church recently. The Vatican bank scandals in the late 1970s, which are said to have somehow involved the death of Pope John Paul I. And of course, more obviously, the sexual abuse scandals by priests of children in the Catholic Church. There's that. We have all these examples. We have the history of persecution, the fact that, after the Christianity gained control of the Roman Empire, the first things Christians did was to persecute each other. These are the evils, it is said, of organized religion. To do with dogmas. It's said that faith is what you die for, doctrine's what you kill for. It's a nice phrase. I think it's rather misleading, but this is the kind of thing that appeals to people who describe themselves as spiritual. Now, what should we say about the rejection of dogma? Okay, well, sometimes we might reject creeds and authorities altogether because they're said to be against the real spirit of religion. So in that spirit, people say, well, of course, look at Jesus. He fell out with the authorities of his time, And according to Gezer Vermesh, the great leading biblical scholar, he would have been very surprised to find out that he was the second person of the Trinity. We have all these sorts of ideas pushing around. But then again, the problem is the emotional impetus behind the rejection of dogma is, to some extent, a kind of relativism, a sort of semi-education, a naive individualism that says, who's the church to tell us what's true? Who are the hierarchies to tell us? And what's lost in this attitude is a proper sense that both religion and spirituality are ultimately about truth, that truth matters. Truth does not depend on individual opinion. How the world is, whether there's a God or not, is not up to me. It's not up to us. We can't just make it up. And this is what's lost in the spiritual attitude. Similarly with the problem with authoritarianism, people don't like being told what to do, told what to think. And of course there are huge problems with the transmission of authority, with conflict between creeds, with religious wars, all these things. But what is often lost in this attitude is the idea that in religious traditions there are the resources for rational thinking about religion. We can't just do without it. We know that authorities that declare themselves infallible are often no such thing, but there's a case for saying, nonetheless, that you shouldn't take anything seriously unless it does declare its own infallibility. That's a radical view to take, but it's one that deserves some sort of attention. We can't just do without it. Well, I'm agnostic, I don't know, but nonetheless, there are facts about our condition. We die, we love. We ask questions, what's worth loving, what's worth doing? These are spiritual questions, and these are the questions that can be asked outside the religious framework.
I wanted to take as an example environmentalism. Now, often when people say environmentalism is like a religion, they mean to slag off environmentalism by saying it's irrational, it's not really science-based, and so on. And that's not my point here. On one hand, there's a sense of being part of nature, the more spiritual side, a feeling of being connected, an affinity with the natural world. That's something that we can all feel, whether we subscribe to environmentalism as an idea. But then there is the more religious aspect, if you like. There are certain things that you have to do if you're going to be an environmentalist, that the belief should lead to certain actions. And take something like recycling, that if you're a good environmentalist, you're a good member of the natural community, then you should recycle. But I think it's slightly more complicated than seeing it in terms of a practical thing, because it strikes me there's a similarity or a comparison to be made between something like recycling and the Christian Eucharist, because there's different ways of understanding it. So for Catholics, when people take communion, the wine becomes the blood of Christ, literally. For Protestants, it's symbolic of that relationship. So it doesn't matter that it's not actually happening, but it plays a religious role because of the symbolism there. And actually, I think you could do the same thing with recycling. I'm not sure if this is a position anyone takes, but I don't think you literally have to believe that recycling is going to save the world, or even to have an effect, to think it might be a good thing to do. But perhaps symbolically, the fact that we take care not to waste things reminds us of our relationship with nature. It's a responsible way to live, and there's something which is religious about that. Again, I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. Maybe it's a good thing to have that kind of connection. So that's not a position I'm endorsing, recycling as religion, but I think it's a tenable one, and one I think that we could take seriously in looking at other religious practices. But there would always be, a proper environmentalist would say, well, that's not the point. The point is to stop destroying the planet. The point is to make an effect. And it would once emphasize that how you feel about yourself isn't the important thing. So there's always going to be an argument about cultural practices, about what's really important. And there's a really interesting example of that in Christianity, which is to do with the practice of speaking in tongues, which was very important in the early church. This is where people are seized by some kind of spirit and start talking in gibberish, which may or may not mean something. There was always arguments about what it actually meant, whether it was God, whether it was something else. But it was something that was practiced quite widely in the early church. But the Apostle Paul was quite ambivalent about it, and there's a very interesting thing that he wrote in letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 14, if anyone's curious to look it up, where he talks about, yes, speaking in tongues is good. It's part of our church, and people seem to enjoy it. The Corinthians were very keen on speaking in tongues, and he said, yes, it's good, I get that, but can you do it in moderation? Just don't get carried away, because frankly, it looks really weird, and people are starting to think we're a cult. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but I think this is the sentiment. And on one hand, it was quite a practical thing, that you don't want to put people off the new faith by acting like weirdos. But also, there was a sense that it's wrong to fetishize this one aspect of Christian practice. And he thought that his fellow Christians were getting overly carried away with this one thing, and it wasn't healthy. That he needed to focus on God, and that meant other things than just speaking in tongues. So there was a sense that they were, whether you call it an excessive spirituality because they were getting carried away with themselves, or an excessive religiosity because it was a ritual that they got into, I don't know. But there was a sense that it was off at one of the extremes or the other, and it wasn't a good thing. I think that's really interesting because Paul's often seen as the founder of Christianity as a religion in the bad sense. The guy who made up all the rules and so on. But I think there's a certain pragmatism there, but also that comes from faith. That is an assurance that what the religion is about doesn't have to be pinned down in particular things. And I think that's quite a healthy thing that you might want to apply to secular life as well. I think that it's a problem in secular life, whether it's environmentalism or anything else, to become dogmatic. And just to give an example of that, I was really taken with what Andrew said about people having materialistic idea about truth. I very much agree. On morality and meaning, I'm not so sure what it means to have a materialistic view. And one example that comes to mind is something like, what is your response to circumcision? So there's been a dispute recently following what happened in Germany about wanting to ban circumcision and say it shouldn't be allowed. Now, it seems to me that any human-centered morality, based on the here and now, would think, well, here's a practice that's been going on for centuries. Millions of loving parents do it to their children and feel that it's good for them. So why get upset about it? Why interfere? It seems to me only by elevating a particular principle above this practical, day-to-day human-based morality, that you must never violate the body of another, could you come to this position? And it seems to me that that's a dogmatically religious position. You know, it's been taken by certain people from an atheist perspective, but that, there is always a danger of atheism becoming a religion in the bad way. And it seems to me that the important thing is to have maintain a more human-centered idea of morality. And I'll be keen to discuss this in more detail. But it seems to me that it's not just religious lunatics we should look out for in terms of excessive religiosity, but there are other aspects where people sometimes behave that way.
I end up being the token out and proud religious person on quite a lot of panels at the moment. And as such, I'm going to try and speak quite personally. I'm not actually going to offer you any stats, even though I work for a think tank, because I think that everyone in this room has got a horse in this race. I don't think anyone in this room is neutral about it. And the things that I find really interesting are where particular people are coming from and how we've arrived at that. I'm also going to be speaking as a Christian. Religion is a useful shorthand, but I think there's some intellectual problems with conflating religion, and as Piers pointed out, it's very difficult to define. So I can't pretend to be kind of speaking for all religions. I find this question very difficult to answer personally, and that's for two reasons. The first is just, I think, historical contingency. I'm a child of my generation. I went through the same universities, I read the same books, I've been exposed to the same media as everybody else, and therefore I have a deep suspicion of authority, of hierarchy, of things that seem to be exclusive, of things that seem to be arrogant, of big explanatory narratives. So religion and the ways it's been described today, of course, it feels like the natural contemporary reaction to it is hostility. To further complicate this, there's a very powerful strand within Christianity which is very hostile to the idea of religion. The two biggest theologians of the 20th century, arguably, Karl Barth and Bonhoeffer, both talked about a religionless Christianity. And that's not a new thing. Through the centuries, people have noticed that in the New Testament, Jesus was most hostile to the religious leaders of his day. The Pharisees and their outward forms, their self-righteousness, their neglect of the poor and marginalized, their religiosity was what annoyed Jesus, got him actually very, very angry. So I think even within Christianity, there's the sense that religion isn't quite the right label. I did a Twitter poll. Linda will be horrified, very unscientific method. But I said, are you religious, spiritual, or neither? And most of my atheist followers replied, neither, or other people think I'm spiritual and I don't really know. And most of my Christian followers replied, neither. Neither of those labels fit me. I can see that sociologically I'm religious. Other people think I'm religious. Theologically, I don't think I'm either. I don't think Christianity fits easily into either of those categories. So we have a real complexity with the terms here. Despite all this, I wanted to kind of challenge myself as someone who's grown out of both of those two kinds of cultural soil to give a little bit of a defense of religion. And I think Linda has written very well and very widely on, and so I think preeminently has Charles Taylor, on the idea of this subjective turn in culture. The spiritual revolution comes from a turn from external structures, from institution, from hierarchy and authority, inwards towards self-actualization and self-fulfillment, to the inner world. You could link that in probably quite a value-laden way to kind of individualism and particularly consumerism, but I think that there's a fairly widespread agreement that that is a turn, that's a change in culture, away from religion towards spirituality in very simple terms. And I think actually, and this might sound very heretical to this audience, religion can be a hugely powerful balancing to that, because it dethrones the self. It points us outwards from ourselves to God and to others, through worship, through community involvement, through practices that are bigger than ourselves. It puts me, as I experience it, in my place in the best possible way. It curbs my narcissism, and it insists that there is a givenness about the world and a givenness about other people, which I cannot ignore. Christianity and other religions define personhood according to our relationships. We don't actually buy into the Enlightenment idea of the human person as an atomized, discrete, moral actor, completely independent in the final account from others. It says human persons are fundamentally interdependent and relational. Rowan Williams gave the Theos annual lecture a few weeks ago, fleshing this out wonderfully if you're interested. So what religion does at its best is it insists on the dignity and the fallibility of the self. It says you only find your true self in God and in others. It doesn't flatten or deny individualities, but it says personhood flourishes best in committed covenant communities with people who aren't just going to reflect you back at yourself. Marriage is quite a good, I think, picture for this. You do actually give up a bit of your autonomy. You do give up a bit of your individualism, but you get something so much better. You get intimacy, and I think, perversely almost, freedom. So I think psychologically, that's less oppressive than the kind of spiritualities that either deny the self, that say you don't even really exist, your desires don't exist, distance yourself, corrode yourself. Or the kind of spiritualities, which are probably more common, I think, in this country, which say, turn inwards, almost deify the self. You are central. If you can fulfill yourself, if you can actualize yourself, then that is true freedom. I think actually both of those are just quite bad for us. So finally, religions have had centuries of embedding human beings in communities, of saying, you matter, but you're not ultimate. Come and learn from our shared history, from this repository of wisdom, from these symbols and these stories, and add your symbols and your stories to them. Experience God for yourself, but do it with us. I think you can be part of a religion without checking in your brain at the door, without giving up on the self or submitting to oppressive, hierarchical, authoritative structures. But there is a little bit of submission required. It's very countercultural. There is a little bit of saying, yes, I have need, I have weakness, I am not all that matters. And I think where we are now in this society, that's a wonderful, beautiful, healthy thing.
If there is anything that anyone particularly wants to respond to that another has said, then do just jump in. But just to kick things off, I mean, I found what Elizabeth had to say about religion's importance being about the dethroning of the self and about moving away from narcissism. And the thing that I've really struggled in just thinking about this session is thinking about where does spirituality fit into that? Because in many ways the charge against spirituality as defined against religion seems to be about it being narcissistic, I suppose. So where does spirituality fit into that dethroning of the self that you spoke about, Elizabeth? Anybody?
I've spent a lot of time talking to people who say they're spiritual, and I absolutely think this charge of narcissism is completely off the mark. I think that people who are actively involved in a spiritual quest these days are thinking about, rather as Elizabeth put it, where's the centre of things? And they're saying it's partly in my friends, it's partly in sacred places, it's partly in the whole planet. We have to rethink what's really sacred. And there's a whole new opening up and exploration of what really counts in life going on. And it's much more sincere and interesting and innovative than saying these are all a load of narcissistic. It's usually women, actually. There's a very sexist element to that critique. Women sort of navel-gazing and going to yoga classes. I think that's just not how it is. So my statistics were also meant to be saying there's actually a majority of people in this country who are morally serious, who are thinking seriously about life and how things are. And as many of my fellow sociologists do, to call them confused, muddled and fuzzy because they don't fit neatly into our statistical categories is an unfortunate insult for a much more sincere, kind of historical change that's going on, I think.
Andrew?
I think I probably agree with a large part of that, and I think I'd go further as well in responding to what Elizabeth just said, which is that I think that actually a lot of what replaces religious ways of thinking for people today, a lot of what Linda would call spiritual, I wouldn't call spiritual, is actually relational in its nature. It's about thinking about our connectedness with other people, about thinking about our connectedness with the natural environment that we find ourselves in. Yes, also about thinking about our connectedness with our own selves and the narratives that we make in our head that, allow us to give meaning to the experiences that we're having, but also it's a very outward-looking, quite often, way of thinking. So I think that although Elizabeth obviously wants to sort of reclaim for religion that spirit of promoting relatedness and thinking about yourself as connected to other things, I think it's actually far more typical of a non-religious or post-religious way of thinking, because I think that you can't get away from the fact, I think, that most religions do make exclusive claims. They do make exclusive claims about what is true and what is not true, and that's why they lead to often in-groups and out-groups, and why they're very successful and strong in building communities quite often. But I think it does deny the sort of more connected thinking and relational thinking that non-religious approaches make more likely. So I don't disagree, obviously, with Elizabeth that she finds that in her Christianity, but I do disagree with the idea that somehow it's from religion that it will mostly come. I think the opposite is true.
Okay, Piers?
Yes, briefly, I actually agree with quite a lot of what Elizabeth said, even though she's a Christian and I'm not. I mean, Christianity makes specific claims. I mean, there is a God. Jesus rose from the dead. These are astonishing claims. I don't mean that in a skeptical way. I mean, I don't mean they're improbable per se. I just mean they're astonishing. There are aspects of reality that Christians have to take on board, and I have not really got to the point of being able to. But I do think, again, I agree with Linda, whilst I think that there is a sort of narcissistic, new agey feel about some types of spirituality, I do agree with Linda that it's not the case for most people. I'm talking to my Muslim students, Christian students, agnostic students. Very often they say very much the same sorts of things about the meaning of life, about neighbourliness, about value, about submission, about God. Okay, Muslims don't believe in the resurrection, and Christians do, and you can have lots of religious wars about that in different times. But in a way, in a secular age, these differences tend to be swept aside and forgotten or fudged away, and people agree on spiritual things. As to the philosophical side, just briefly, I think that this may not be quite the spiritual, but it is, if you like, the metaphysical. Thinking about what we human beings are in the order of things, the fact that we are the only known creatures who are able to be self-reflective, to use the word I and the word we, to think of ourselves as having arisen from a certain mysterious condition that we're going to die. These, in themselves, impose burdens of inquiry and burdens of how to live upon us. We can ignore them, but we can't really do without them. And one way to put this is a realization that we did not create ourselves, as the psalmist said. That is the religious impulse. We did not make ourselves. We must live in the light of that fact. So,
Thank you. Dolan, the idea of this being about the connectedness of people, is that what spirituality is?
Yeah, I think, it often is, but I also think that's not necessarily a good thing. So when Elizabeth's talking about Christianity making people interconnected, I kind of think that's not unique to Christianity, that it's an idea which is very prevalent, as other people have said. And there is a danger it's a bit woolly. I mean, I actually quite like, I watched a lecture online by an American Christian talking about the film Avatar and really laying into it as this kind of contemporary pagan epic. And talking about how there's a tendency, even among some Christians as well, to worship creation rather than the creator. And he was very big on that distinction, that Christians are supposed to worship God and not the things that God has made. So to get overly obsessed with the planet and nature even was for him a problem. And that was kind of interesting, I mean, just because it's different. But I think that the idea I find interesting in Christianity is actually individualism. I see as being historically a product of Christianity, and particularly the idea that each individual matters, which is to say it's not just that you're part of a big system and you have a place in it, but that as an individual you have a particular relationship with God, that you matter as outside of that. And I think that's in Islam as well, and perhaps other religions, but not in all by any means. And I think that that's quite a radical idea which has been brought into modern culture since the Reformation and the Enlightenment. I don't think it depends on the idea of God. But I do think it's a bit, it's nothing to do with creator versus created, but it's the idea of humans being a special part of creation, that we're not just part of this big mix and we all kind of blend together, but there's something special about humanity and each individual human being. That to me is an important Enlightenment idea which does have religious roots, but which is also at odds with this kind of overly wishy-washy idea that we're just all connected.
Elizabeth?
I think we're going to keep coming up against this in this discussion, isn't it, of how laden all these terms are. And certainly I very much hear Andrew and Linda. I think that there's a symbiotic relationship between spirituality and religion, and contemporary forms of religion have taken huge amounts, practices that would more easily be labelled spiritual and vice versa. I certainly didn't mean to fall into that trap, I think, of categorising spirituality as somehow woolly or less morally serious. My religious faith helps my narcissism, is really what I was saying there. I do think, to push back on it a little bit, that perhaps if you can define a difference, the difference is about community and embedded community. I think that if you read some of Linda's work and look at the practices that are very prevalent now in places like Kendal, where big studies have been done, those that would more easily fall into the category of religion are less embedded in community. They're informal networks, but there's less of a sense of, I am committed to you and you are committed to me because of something that we share long term. And even if it's only that, and that can be deeply unhealthy as well as healthy, but that might be the way that you could see a difference in attitudes to the self between spirituality and religion, in a way that does make you think differently about your own importance. But this is so complex. The way we're using these terms is so complex that I think, we're going to keep coming up against it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Question to Linda. I'm very struck this whole discussion has been only about Britain. Religion exists pretty widely. Do these categories, your last 5 categories, which I thought were perhaps the most interesting thing, because you're actually trying to tie it down, have you checked with other colleagues around the world? Do they apply elsewhere? I'm thinking particularly, of course, of the urbanized world. I was wondering about urban India. I was wondering about urban Turkey, relation to Hinduism, etc., Islam. Do you have the same potential categories, maybe, dare I say, earlier, at the risk of being accused of all sorts of things, stage of development, but nevertheless observably developing?
Okay. Thank you.
One thing that really interests me in this debate are the very early romantics, because they seem to be emphasising the human, but they're doing it in this really religious language, and people like William Blake are making the human being into God, or God into the human being, whatever you want, but which is now seen as a critique of the Enlightenment and is seen as all that anti-hierarchy and anti-dogma stuff, when really, to me, it seems to be a critique of religious thinking, of people having these religious ideas and then using that to squash human freedom. And now we walk around going, wasn't William Blake this really cool hippie? when actually he's banging on about the sovereignty of the Lord Jesus all of the time. I just wondered if you had any views on that particular point in history.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, something I don't understand, so perhaps you can help me with it, is you talked about spiritualism being relational. And as far as I can see, or from people I know who perhaps reject religion, including my father-in-law, my stepfather, who's an interfaith minister. And as far as I can tell, that sort of means he doesn't believe in any religion. But people like him seem to reject the idea of any morality being imposed from outside. That any morality, one person's morality is better than another person's morality. So they do seem to retreat into relativism and look for any sense of morality coming from the self, which obviously then perhaps isn't morality. But so what I don't understand is if that's the case, then how can spiritualism be relational? How can it be about making connections with other people?
Okay, thank you.
Not surprisingly, we're having great problems with words, as we always do in this kind of conversation. One point that it seems to me important to bear in mind is that we can't pose religion and spirituality as if they are over and against each other, because every great religious tradition has a great tradition of the spirituality which it has developed. Now, it is, of course, the case that because religious institutions have been going through a period of decline, spiritualities have sprung up outside those religious traditions. So for me, the distinction would be between someone who is religious, which includes being spiritual, and somebody who does not want to say that they are religious, but does want to say that they're spiritual. And it seems to me that what the claim is that is being made there is indeed a riposte to a materialist reductionism, and saying we aren't simply lumps of meat which give off electrical impulses. And in that context, I'd like to ask Andrew, in what sense is morality based on a materialist position?
Okay, well, I'm going to deal with that question at the end, and also with the one at the same time about the spiritual and relational nature of morality and so on. I mean, I think it's quite right that part of this is a problem with terms, right? So I don't like the word spiritual because it seems to me to reflect too much a sense of some sort of external reality, some invisible other layer to things that one can reach through non-traditional means of, somehow transcendental or separate, right? That's why I don't like the word spiritual. However, there are definitions of the word spiritual that go something like spirituality is about our inner life, the way we attribute meaning to experience, the relationships that we have to the external world and our fellow creatures, okay? And those definitions of spirituality, obviously, a lot of what I'm talking about would be covered by that word. So and there are definitional problems, I can see that. My use of the word materialist is part of that same definitional problem, because I'm trying to find a word that will convey the substance of spiritual in the definition I just gave without using the word spiritual, which to me is tainted by the associations with sort of external, non-human, spiritual sort of actors. And this is a problem with the word spiritual. If you Google the word spiritual, you've got everything from crystals and whale song to the mass, right? I mean, it's a whole range of different things. So I think that when I was using the word materialistic to apply to things like morals and meaning, I mean, rooted in the here and now, rooted in this reality, the one that we're experiencing, right? Human beings as material things not connected to anything transcendent, making our decisions based on sort of the reality that we're experiencing. That's what I was sort of grasping for when I talked about morality. And then, as a last point, to develop that idea of morality in response to your question, I don't think that morality needs an external arbiter or standard in order to have a firm basis and be shared, right? So I don't think that we have to refer to some external source for objectivity and morality. I think we can look around us, observe that shared human needs do exist, that we have a lot more in common in our desires and wants for how we want to be treated than we have different from each other, and that provides a natural and materialistic basis for guiding and moulding our moral behaviour to each other. So that's where I would root morality. I'd root morality in the human being in the here and now, rather than in any external tablet of stone.
I think that the Romantics idea is a very interesting one, and I know very little actually about the period, but what it triggered off is a memory that the Romantics were some of the first people to start talking about the sublime, to start trying to codify or name or study the sense that we get that there is something bigger than ourselves, that other people would maybe use the word numinous, this feeling, this experience actually that we get in the presence of very big things, often in the presence of nature, but also in our interpersonal relationships and in great moments of tragedy or great moments of joy, the sense that something is bigger than me, this reaching outwards, which I think actually is probably a very fundamental element of both religion and spirituality, complex as those terms are. And when people say neither, I'm interested, and some days I say neither, I'm interested in where that fits, where the numinous and the sublime fits. And I'd be really interested to hear Andrew's response on that, because I think it's probably related to his last answer. And yeah.
Yeah, I think the language question is interesting. In a sense, it's unavoidable, and one of the reasons that I think we continue to have this type of discussion is that secular culture hasn't completely usurped religious language. We don't have a word for everything. The very word spirit, in fact, soul. I mean, I think there is some kind of soul. It doesn't necessarily have to be understood in a religious sense, but I don't think that ourselves are reducible either to material flesh or to psychology. You know, psychology is a useful discipline, but it certainly hasn't answered the questions about what it is to be human. So that's not to say that we will always have to use religious language, but I do think it doesn't answer questions, but allows us to ask certain questions that are difficult to put in secular terms. Even something like sin, I think the religious idea of sin is much deeper than just being unethical. It's much more problematic. It's much more to do with human nature, and I think I recognize something to do with it without necessarily embracing religious ideas entirely. So it's kind of the default language that we fall back on. And I think it's important that as atheism can't possibly be a default position, it's culturally embedded. And so the language does linger. Just one other thing I wanted to pick up on was this question of outside of the UK. I've done some work with the debating maths competition in India. First of all, I have to say that Indian religion is a complete mystery to me. It's a million different variations of Hinduism and so on. But one thing that's interesting historically there is that the Hindu system was very much bound up with the caste system and social hierarchy. And this is the sense of being connected to others in a bad way, that you have a place in society and you in a sense, don't matter. And for that reason, people at the lower end of Hinduism have often been attracted to Islam or Christianity or more laterally Buddhism, because they think, well, I'm not in for this Hinduism if I'm going to be at the bottom of the pile. Even quite recently, whole villages of Dalits have converted to Islam because it seems to appeal to the idea of that they matter as individuals. You know, whereas Gandhi famously described the untouchables as the children of God, but really didn't want to do much about it. And so there's a sense that spiritualism can cover a multitude of sins, especially if it's this idea of just an interconnected system, and never mind, you might do better next time, these kinds of ideas. But the problem, in India, secular modernity was the big idea with independence, but it doesn't answer all the questions, and so religion hasn't gone away.
Piers and then Linda, and then we'll go back out.
Partly some new points, partly just those from those arising. It strikes me as significant that this debate's been called religion or spirituality. And I want to suggest that in spite of the misuses of the term spirituality by people who do go in for narcissistic or new agey ideas, there is such a role. In other words, we could be made of physically investigatable stuff. You know, we are our brains. That's a possible, I mean, I don't know whether it's true or not. It's a possibility. But we have certain unique properties. We can think about who we are, how we should live, our mortality, how we relate to other people. We can have thoughts about our need for humility, community, and morality. Just to pick up on the point about morality, I don't think either religion or morality or spirituality can be identified with each other. In fact, even within religion, that's the case. You could say that Jesus accepts morality as being given by the Mosaic law, but then goes beyond it. You know, what he introduces is something super moral. But anyway, I think the point is we can make room for a suitably rational spirituality, which is focused on the concern for truth and its importance, which I said in my talk originally is lacking in some forms of New Agey type spirituality, whilst accepting that at the level of what there is, naturalism might be the truth.
Linda.
Thank you very much for the first question, which I think is an excellent one to move us just off the British stage. There are similar figures for the USA and Europe, and they just show slight variations. But it's a really good question because it makes us remember that these terms they're very specific to a Christian context, very specific. So I think we get our meaning of religion, we think of something monotheistic from where we are. And spirituality, actually, historically, is a term that's used by people who say, I want to dissociate myself from the Christian churches. So they are absolutely historically and geographically rooted terms, and that's the debate we're having about us here. Could you use these terms and do a similar survey in other parts of the world? Not really. But sort of, well, yes and no, and let me explain why. I think the narrowness of our thinking about religion is often because we assume that monotheism is real religion. And actually, monotheism is one very particular type of religion. You can make a very good argument that the most common form of religion, historically, and perhaps even today, is, polytheism is a terrible word because it derives from monotheism, but a kind of religion in which people believe in many, many, many manifestations of the sacred, in which the divine takes many forms, in which people feel there are many windows onto the sacred. Human beings, living enlightened beings, can be direct manifestations of the sacred. Certain places in the natural world are. There are many gods and goddesses. This is very common. I did my original research in India, and this is very much the case there. Now, nevertheless, in the contemporary world, there's a very interesting kind of struggle going on worldwide between the great crusading monotheisms of Islam and Christianity in particular, which are the world's largest monotheisms, and a defence and recovery of indigenous traditions which aren't monotheistic. And you're seeing in some places like India and Africa and Latin America more defence now of the indigenous traditions of African spirit healing or of whatever it might be. So there's a very interesting, you might, coming back to your question, you might be able to translate those sorts of developments into religious, spiritual, or neither, but they're going to mean something rather interestingly different if you do. And finally, on Blake, it's nice to have a mention of Blake. I love William Blake. But what Blake reminds us is that all religions, all the great religions and the great monotheisms as well, actually are very internally diverse. And actually the great monotheisms, when you look at them, are often very pluralistic and polytheistic. Look at Catholicism. It's got all sorts of gods and goddesses but in reality. What Blake did is to make an internal critique of a priestly kind of Christianity from within Christianity using Christian terms. I wrote, this isn't meant to be a plug, but I wrote a little book called A Very Short Introduction to Christianity, and what I say in that book is there are three religions called Christianity, and they're very, very different. And one is priestly and church-based, one is Bible-based and more Protestant, and one is mystical. And Blake is a defender of the mystical version of Christianity against the church type of Christianity. So, again, we oversimplify the great religions and think they've all got one clear kind of set of beliefs and packages. They haven't. They're hugely rich and internally diverse, and there's constant change going on within them as well.
Okay, thank you.
The question I have relates to church attendances, which is something that I've looked at in a marketing context, where the numbers attending on a regular basis have declined rapidly with the Catholic Church and the Church of England, much more rapidly with the Church of England, and there's now about 5% each of those members attending, roughly about 1 million. Now, in the USA, I understand that up to 40% of some areas of the population attend church. I have a theory about why that is, but I would defer, obviously, to the panel, assuming that that is true, and Linda would know it is broadly true, I believe. Why is that? Talking about essentially Christian religions or versions of Christian religions over there.
Okay, thanks.
I'm reminded of the passage in the New Testament when Jesus said they thought he was a spirit. On this question of definition, we've had several contrasts: religion and spiritual, religion and scientific, and material and spiritual. And of course, these are all embedded in a modernist way of thinking. I'm intrigued, perhaps between Piers and Andrew, on this question of truth. Do you think truth is material? Things like logic, mathematics, truth relations, are they material things? And if not, isn't that precisely the kind of consideration to say, if material is rational, if material can be true, well, we need to talk about spirit, Comte, Hegel, etc., world spirit coming to realize itself. Yeah, what is truth?
Thank you very much.
Would the panel say that religion is good for communities and society overall? And if so, should it be encouraged?
I'm just wondering to what extent spirituality and religion are satisfying a human need, that they have a common basis. In other words, that we all feel a need to express gratitude, to pray and worship, to celebrate. And I'm just wondering whether these faith, trust and hope, celebration, prayer, expression of gratitude are basic human traits triggered by the fact that we absolutely know that our lineage throughout existence and primeval ooze has been favoured, that we're here while everybody else fell by the wayside. In fact, we've got reason to trust and hope and to have faith because we're here, which is such an sort of almost impossible event. And also the interconnectedness, although we don't know the greater whole to which we belong, but which is the basis of altruism, cooperation, and sacrifice and service, that it is again basic human trait. Yeah. So I'm just wondering whether religion provides a home for spirituality.
Thank you very much.
I would suggest the thing that we all have in common is subconscious terror associated with death. We have to manage that fear. And interestingly, the decline of organized religion has mirrored a rise in life expectancy. That's true all over the world. Where death rates are highest, religion finds the most fertile ground, and where the fear of death is greatest, the highest murder rates, again you find the highest levels of religiosity. And so if there is a hole that's in the human heart, as per the topic, is it not in some sense to do with managing the subconscious terror associated with mortality?
Okay, thank you very much. So quick fire responses first, and then we'll just have a minute each or so just to sum up.
Yeah, I can't think of a direct response. The thing that came into my head was this idea of a yearning for something spiritual, but I think there's also sometimes a yearning for something like morality. And just a funny little example from Glee, the American TV show about the Glee Club at school. Obviously, it's a very gay-friendly program being set in a Glee Club, but also because it's set in the Midwest, it's assumed that everyone's Christian, basically. So they've kind of explicitly resolved this by deciding that they're the sort of Christians who think it's okay to be gay, and that's been done. But there's an interesting exchange about something different, featuring the one character who's a more serious Christian, who's a kind of hippie character, I've forgotten his name. But he's agonizing over whether he should have sex with his girlfriend. And he's thinking, well, a good Christian shouldn't have premarital sex. And he talks to one of the other boys, and he says, well, don't worry about it. It's like all that stuff about you're not supposed to have tattoos or mix fibers. And he's kind of basically, he doesn't actually say it, but he's saying it's like that stuff in Leviticus. It says it's wrong to be gay, and we know that can't be right, so chill out about it. And what's interesting is that the kid is not convinced by this. He thinks, no, there is something here. And I don't know whether you call it spiritual or religious, but he has some sense that something special about sex that means he shouldn't treat it too lightly. And he wanted some kind of religious guidance about that. And the thing is, secular culture will say, well, don't have sex until you're ready, or understand it in very health terms, but doesn't really have a lot to say about the morality of it. And I think although, most, in secular society we tend not to think that homosexuality is a big deal, it doesn't mean there's no such thing as sexual morality. But there isn't necessarily a good language for talking about that. And there's a sort of, perhaps, a yearning for actually, maybe we should have a way of talking about it, whether it's religious or not. But just to say that it's not just that we all yearn for something spiritual, but that there might be something in the more religious side of religion, if you like, that we could also feel is missing.
Well, of course, truth is not a physical object. It is, if an object at all, it's an abstract object. So it's like courage or kindness. I can say, yes, there is courage, but it's not a physical thing. There's kindness, not a physical thing. My point about truth, and I think I agree with Andrew Copson here, is that whatever the values there might be in feelings or spirituality or emotions, at least part of religion and spirituality is about the concern for truth, the drive for truth. And that, by definition, it seems to me, requires reason. Reason is what gets you from truth to truth. If you use reason, you can't get from truth to falsehood. And that's actually what's magical about it. But of course, there's much more to it than that. On the fear of death, well, yes, of course, I agree that if we didn't die, or if indeed we didn't have to do anything in life at all, we just sat around, in the Garden of Eden with everything done for us, we might not think much about God or about our lives or destiny. But what's hinted at in the question is a sort of naturalistic explanation of religious belief, of the sort that Freudians and Marxists and many others came up with. We can explain why religion would come about even if it were entirely false, therefore we can dispense with the appeal to religious truth. Well, I don't think it's decisive. I think both these things can be the case, can be true, but there is a tension between naturalistic explanations of religion and creedal explanations. Just a tension, no more than that. On the question that Dolan's just touched on, that's fascinating. It's quite significant that issues, for example, to do with death, the creation of life, the end of life, and sex do seem to be implicated in religious thinking, both in the minds of the religious and in those most antithetical, those who have the most antipathy to religion. Well, because all these things concern the sacred. And this is a very hard concept to grasp, but take the case of sex. You might argue that in sex, one's self is revealed, one is made vulnerable through one's body, in one's body, and therefore requires to be protected by all sorts of taboos and protections and vulnerabilities. And this sort of thought gets given secular expression, for example, in campaigns against the commodification or the depersonalization of the human body. There's a religious impulse behind all this, even if it's not actually acknowledged as such. And I think that many of the taboos of religion are rationally explained and not explained away in this way. So that's just a few thoughts.
Thank you very much.
The US and UK question is really interesting, and Linda may well have some more concrete thing to offer you. I think that there's a few theories that float around. One of them is the kind of makeup of the original population, the kind of zealots fleeing Europe, which created a particular kind of culture which has trickled down through the generations. There's another interesting thing if you look at the UK context, whether there is actually something about establishment, something about the enmeshment of church and state, which has the opposite effect that you might expect, in that it actually kind of keeps a lid on some of the more zealous expressions of particular religions. But I'd be interested to hear what Linda says. I think the fear of death one is clearly central to lots of this, but I don't think it's sole, in that the religious or spiritual instinct comes from a bigger set of questions about meaning, about why am I here, what is a good life, where have I come from and where am I going. And I think actually that most people don't take the fear of death and a very straightforwardly naturalistic or materialistic view, which refuses to ascribe meaning and go down that route, which ultimately ends in a kind of nihilist existentialism. Most people do find frameworks of meaning which are not solely based on the material world. They interact with it. I'm sure Andrew's shaking his head. But I'm not saying they're in opposition to the material world, but they're certainly not going down the kind of scariest route psychologically. But yeah, I would say fear of death, very central.
Thank you.
The US figures, we've got very good figures for this country of church going. I myself was involved in actually sending out hundreds of students and counting, so we know about 6% of people go to church, about 6% in total on an average Sunday. The USA is much vaguer because the 40% figure comes from what people say they do, and we know that they exaggerate. But somebody came up with a great way of counting how many Americans go to church. If you stop and think for a bit, you can probably work out. All Americans go to church by car, because no public transport. So just count the number of cars in the parking lot outside the church and work out what's the average number in a car, and you can get very accurate figures. So actually, it's nearer to sort of 20%. But that's over the nation as a whole. You're right, in some areas, it's higher than that in the States. Whatever, it's more than double what it is here. So why? There are a number of explanations. I think there are several reasons. One is, historically, in the USA, the churches are identified with freedom and democracy against the oppressive force of colonial British power, whereas in a country like France, the churches were identified with tyranny against the forces of democracy and freedom. So the churches are very positively viewed. Being Christian is very much bound up with national identity and what it is to be an American and a good American, and the opposition to communism, of course, in the Cold War period. And some people also make the argument that the lack of a very strong welfare system in the USA is an important factor as well in making religion absolutely crucial to people's day-to-day existence. And I'll end with the huge question of is religion a force for good? Let me answer it like this. As a sociologist, I think that religion it's the most important place where people conduct social experiments, where people are able to think about and actually embody whole different ways of living and relating to one another. My colleague Kim Knott spent a lot of her life studying the Hare Krishnas, and she says, I'm not a Hare Krishna, I never could be, but they were trying to live a life as if love is the only thing that matters. And I'm really glad that there's somewhere in the world that there's some groups who are actually trying to do that kind of absurd and impossible thing, but that makes the world a better place. Of course, some social experiments are not particularly good ones. Not all forms of religion are good. But I can't imagine that we could be human without having religion and that kind of incubation of cultural and social experiment and change.
Thanks. Andrew.
On the fear point, I'm not sure if I entirely agree with you that all religions do have their original source in fear, but it's an entirely respectable point. It was, to quote a good humanist as we come towards the end, it was Bertrand Russell's main explanation, religion, since it has its source in terror, was his quote. And he said, it's made it, religions have not just got their origin in fear, but to some extent they've encouraged fear, and they've made fear seem not shameful, he said, because, whereas it should be. The right advice faced with death is be brave, and do what you can to make the life that you have better, in knowledge that it is going to come to an end. Let me see if I can remember his full quote. He said, when I die, I shall rot, and nothing of my ego will survive. I am not young, and I love life, but I should scorn to shiver with terror at the thought of annihilation. Many a man has borne himself proudly on the scaffold. Surely the same pride should teach us to think truly about our place in the world. And I think that sentiment is one that I entirely agree with. Whether or not it reflects the reality of how religions originate, I certainly agree with the sentiment of it. And in connection with the question at the front, I think that, of course, for some people, religions do satisfy the basic human needs of wanting a community, wanting a morality, wanting a sense of meaning. But I think there are many other ways in which those needs are also satisfied for non-religious people.
Thank you. I'd like to thank PwC for supporting this strand, and of course the BHA. It really has been a privilege to partner with them on this session. So let's finish off just in this final kind of 4 or 5 minutes, just a sentence from each of the panellists. So Dolan, if I could start with you.
I think that religious, spiritual, and neither, the best answer is neither, but it's very difficult to be neither. I think we all have a tendency sometimes to religiosity. It's not easy to live your own life completely freely. You can't wake up every morning and decide what it's all about, and decide what's moral. So you're always going to defer to authority to some extent. And I think we should be aware, even if it's not a religious authority, there's always something that we're going with, and that's not necessarily a problem. At the same time, we all have a more individualistic side, which again, we don't want to yield to completely. So I would say that you just emphasize that neither is difficult. I think that those tendencies towards religiosity, those tendencies towards more self-obsessed subjectivity are there not just in religion but elsewhere.
Thank you. Linda.
Okay, I'll leave you with one lovely little statistic. 70% of people in this country believe in a soul, and the number is still growing. And I think that actually is a bit of a problem for Andrew.
Thank you. Doesn't bother me. Piers?
I didn't want to take a utopian view of truth or reason, contrary to what Elizabeth was suggesting. In praising reason, in stressing its importance, I merely stressed that among many other human faculties, it is one which gets us from truth to truth. There are plenty of other things that are important in our thinking and our feeling. That religion is partly about truth, that we have a duty to seek it up to some extent. We must recognize it's difficult. We must search, even pray and ask and be humble, as was suggested. We should recognize the narcissism we all have in ourselves, and I certainly have an enormous amount of it, and we should just accept it, as was rather movingly put in a very interesting new book by Francis Spufford called Why Christianity Makes Surprising Emotional Sense. He calls original sin basically the capacity to fuck things up. And that's a very good way of putting it. I think that if we realize we've all got that, whether we're Christians or Muslims or nothing at all, realize you've got it and learn to live with this measurable fact.
Thanks, Piers. Elizabeth.
The most interesting tweet I got in response to my question was from a Christian, and they said, I am sociologically religious, experientially spiritual, and theologically neither. I think all of us are both religious and spiritual and neither, and none of the above. So it's ridiculously compelling as a question, and actually I think working out these things for ourselves is the most important and interesting question of every human life.
Thank you very much. Andrew.
I don't believe in any reality beyond this one. I think this natural universe is what there is. I do have a sense of values and my obligations to other human beings, but they're rooted in those other human beings in the here and now. And I have a sense of meaning in my life, and I feel sometimes, my soul, in a metaphorical sense, reaching out not just to other people, but to beautiful scenes in nature, in moments of the sublime, as Elizabeth was saying. But I totally reject any sense that that has anything non-material about it, anything non-human about it. I don't think that that way that I live, rooted in the here and now and in place and in time, is religious. I don't think it can fairly be described as spiritual, but I do think it is quite widespread a view and increasingly common, so I think that it is best to describe it as neither, though I wish there were a better word.
Thank you very much.